I want your
Yeah.
voice heard. Yeah, I feel a little differently about it, but I want your voice to be heard. I don't want it to be absent, particularly because I have a little different perspective. You know, I find the idea, listen, I get it.
All right, we will go ahead and get started.
We'll talk about it.
The adequate notice of this meeting is required by the Open Public Meetings Act was provided by the posting, mailing, delivery, and filing of this notice on January 5th, 2022. This notice was on that date posted on the bulletin board in the township office, sent to the Courier News, the Echo Sentinel, and Tappan to Warren, and filed with the township clerk of the Township of Warren, all in accordance with the requirements of the Open Public Meetings Act. For our pledge tonight, I'd like to have the assistance of Sanjay Joshi help us out and lead us off. If you want to come up here, the microphone's all yours.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Well done.
I will now call the roll. Mr. Bishi,
Here.
Mr. Crozen,
Here.
Mr. Desai,
Here.
Mrs. DiMaggio, Ms. Keller,
Here.
Mr. Valentino,
Here.
Mr. Weinstein, Mrs. Zahn,
Here.
and Mr. Brzee.
Here.
We have a quorum.
Resolved that the Board of Education approves the public and private session minutes of the March 14th, 2022 board meeting.
Second. Mr. Bishi,
Yes.
Mr. Crozen,
Yes.
Mr. Desai,
Yes.
Ms. Keller,
Yes.
Mr. Valentino,
Yes.
Mrs. Zahn,
Yes.
and Mr. Brzee.
Yes.
Motion passes 7-0.
Correspondence and information, Dr. Mingles.
Thank you, Mr. Brzee. The board received one email on a return to school topic. There were two HIB investigations, one at Central School that was determined to be HIB and one at Warren Middle School that was not determined to be HIB. And there was one in-school suspension at Warren Middle School.
Thank you, Dr. Mingle. Welcome. Thank you to our woodchucks for having us tonight and sharing your school with us. I know a few of the members got a tour. So thank you, Mr. Heaney, for the preview of the school. And it's definitely good to be back in schools again. Earlier this month, I was also invited here to Woodland as part of Read Across America Day, which was one of the top items that any board member could be asked to do. Green eggs and ham. It was a hit. And then I also, as I was leaving, Mr. Heaney said, you need to go to the library. There's an expressive reading program being done. And it was, I can't do it justice by trying to explain what these kids did and how they read. Quite engaging, very unexpected in a very positive way. So hats off to, again, the woodchucks involved with that. Students, the staff. It was a very fun day to be here at Woodland. So thank you for that. This past Friday, switching gears, switching schools, I went to the Warren Middle School's production of Moana Junior. So it's been 2 years since they've been able to do a production. I've been to a few of these before, and I've never been to one where at the end of the show, parents, students are literally dancing, standing up, dancing in the APR to the song. So it was amazing to see. The students did a phenomenal job. So hats off to the students, number one, but certainly to the staff and the mentors who helped to make that program a success. Dress policy. So at our last committee, we formed an ad hoc committee. So I wanted to share with the board the ad hoc committee members. Chairwoman Zahn will be leading that along with Mr. Croson, Ms. Keller, and Mr. Valentino. So thank you for all of your time that you will be putting forward to that. On tonight's agenda, item C2, I want to again thank our new substitutes that have joined the ranks and will be joining us. That is certainly appreciated. And C4, the retirements keep growing, but we're getting less and less. So congratulations on the retirement to Ms. Lee and Ms. Janasic, who is 26 years, if my math is right. So simply amazing. So all the best to both of them in their retirement. And with that, Dr. Mingo, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Brzee. Welcome to all of our Woodland students and parents for being here tonight. Just to give you a preview, after our student feature, we'll take a very obvious moment to pause, and we'll invite you to exit if you would like to go home and, get ready for the evening and do whatever you need to do as a family. You're welcome to stay for the rest of the meeting. We would encourage you and welcome you with open arms, but that would be the very obvious opportunity to head out if you would like to. A couple things just to echo Mr. Brzee and some other congratulations. I join in the congratulations to the cast and crew of Moana Junior. And as Mr. Brzee said, the first performance of the middle school musical in person since 2019. And especially congratulations to Director Kelly Backus, who's that was her very first musical directorship at Warren Middle School. So congratulations to her. And what has now become a meeting tradition, I have several student recognitions at the middle school as well. And for those that might be new to the board or from the community who are watching at home as well, we do a student celebration at the middle school in May, which is getting longer and longer as we go through week by week. So tonight, congratulations to 8th grade student Emily Wang, who placed first on violin at the New Jersey Music Educators Association All-State Orchestra audition. Her first place placement was among over 300 students who auditioned from all regions of the state. Congratulations as well to Mr. John Saramua, Emily's orchestra teacher at Warren Middle School. And congratulations to Warren Middle School's math fleet teams. This past weekend, the girls competed at Mount St. Mary Academy and the boys competed at St. Joseph's High School. These competitions included over 70 schools and 200 students, and the boys and girls both won their competition. So Warren Middle School was a champion at both the Mount St. Mary and St. Joseph's math competitions. Congratulations to all of our participating students, Dr. Cooper, who advises the competition program, and all of our middle school math teachers who help prepare our students for those competitions. With that, I'll turn it back to you and to our Woodland students.
Thank you, Dr. Mingle. Mr. Heaney, we're going to turn it over to you for our first presentation of the evening. If you need a microphone.
Thank you, Mr. Brzee. Welcome everyone to Woodland School, the home of the Woodchucks. Welcome everyone that is joining us here this evening. So we're very, very lucky to present to you some of our REACH students, 6 wonderful boys here that are going to present to you something that we've been working on here at Woodland School for about 2 years now. We have a building-based goal of building a growth mindset in our students. We want our students to leave Woodland School not only as better mathematicians and scientists and writers and readers and athletes, but we also want them to leave as better human beings. That's really our overall goal. And we believe that the tenets of a growth mindset, perseverance, grit, kindness, hard work, compassion, are all really important things that kids need to develop to be successful as adults. So before I begin, I do want to thank Ms. Pranzo, who's joining us here today, our guidance counselor, who each month leads us in our growth mindset lessons. So she works with a team of teachers to create these lessons that get pushed out to our students once a month for about 40 minutes. And we have a theme each month. And about a month ago, I was really fortunate that one of our teachers and a group of students came to me and said that this time the students created the lesson. What an amazing thing when students are creating lessons that will be given to the other students in the building. So our amazing 6 REACH students in 5th grade developed our last growth mindset lesson, the lesson that we did in February, and it was led by the talented Miss Andrews, who is our REACH teacher. So at this time, I'm going to pass the mic over to Miss Andrews. And guys, I want to thank you for an amazing job. The students, we do get feedback about our growth mindset lessons, and I have to tell you, yours came up as the top. Sorry, Miss Pranzo. I know we work hard to create these lessons, but the student lesson that they created really rose to the top as one of the favorites, especially that gummy bear lesson. The gummy worm lesson was a real hit. So, Miss Andrews.
Thank you, Mr. Heaney. Come on, boys. Come stand up here. So the REACH department had decided together that we thought that there were some life skills that were really pertinent to teach our particular population of students. So we've all had challenges and hardships throughout our lives, and we have to learn how to overcome them. And the same is true for our students. So what we really wanted to do is to give them an arsenal of tools and strategies that they can use so that they know what to do when they're faced with a challenge. So with that, I'm going to let them begin.
Having a growth Having a growth mindset means to
have a positive attitude. People keep a good perspective on challenges.
Another way you can show a growth mindset is by not giving up. Not giving up means to not stop trying, even when times are getting hard.
An additional way you can show growth mindset is perseverance. People keep on trying on any challenge they face.
The concept of there being room for improvement means that nobody's perfect. You can always get better. These are some ideas of what it means to have a growth mindset. Each of us researched a different famous person. We picked them based on who inspires us. We learned different challenges they had to face.
Most of these challenges they had to persevere through to become successful. We took what we learned and made the lesson.
So on the top, there are pictures of students in kindergarten and first grade. And so first they did a read aloud. They watched a read aloud of Humpty Dumpty. So read aloud is about Humpty Dumpty. And so you see in the pictures, they're doing this coloring sheet, and on the top they had to draw something that they knew how to do, and on the bottom they had to draw something that they didn't know how to do yet, and the keyword is yet. Grades 4 and 5 started off with a read aloud about a girl who persevered through many failures. Then they tested their knowledge about a fixed mindset and a growth mindset.
We made an activity that showcased their perseverance. So they had to act out a word or phrase without using any words.
The second and third graders had to do an activity called Save Fred. Groups must put Fred the gummy worm into his gummy lifesaver, and then into a capsized boat. The trick is that they cannot touch Fred with their fingers, but they have to use paper clips.
The second and third graders had to work together and persevere to save Fred in the stormy seas.
The next time you are faced with a challenge, ask yourself,
Will I give up or will I get up?
Thank you very much, children, for that. Fred survived, I presume. Fred was good. That was fantastic. I wish I had lessons like that when I was in grade school. Are there any questions, comments? This is the perfect time for an obvious pause. Oh, sure. Yeah.
Didn't look nervous at all.
Well done. That that is a tough act to follow, Mr. Cook. I just, they set the bar pretty high. So that was impressive. So we will now turn it over to you, Mr. Cook. Before we start, would you prefer for the board, if we have questions, to ask you throughout or hold them off till the end? Fantastic. That works best for us as well. Thank you.
Check. Well, good evening. Scott Cook, obviously proud principal of Mount Horeb School. Sadly, Mr. Kimmick couldn't be with us this evening. He was my co-presenter. He's doing just fine, but personal circumstances are forcing me to go solo. So thank you in advance for your support. Mr. Kimmick and I have been a part of a pretty exciting conversation dating back almost to July 2019. The purpose of tonight is to talk to you about that process and share with you the ultimate recommendation to the board by the working group committee that Bill and I worked with. I'm going to use the word anchor a couple times tonight in tonight's presentation. One of our anchors is the current district mission statement, something that's near and dear to all of our hearts. It's the philosophies and values that we adhere to support all that we do here. That was definitely one of our anchors. Not working. Would be nothing without the people behind the process. During this process, we've had 2 boards of education. We've had ad hoc committee members as part of the process. And lastly, our working group committee members. The committee was almost 30 strong, included parents from all buildings, all grade levels in elementary, administrators, a nurse, a counselor, and board members. A very thorough process, a very thorough group, excuse me. Mr. Kimmick and I, it was really important to us to create a process and facilitate a process that was transparent, thorough, and inclusive. I think that the number of names you see on here on this screen should highlight how inclusive we've tried to be. As mentioned, I'll talk about the process, the timeline, the goal, the summary of the work, the key findings, and then, of course, the suggested next steps should this get board approval. This timeline, I think, serves to support my point earlier about how thorough the process has been. Pause on this. Generally speaking, districts enter into a strategic planning process every 5 or 6 years. They realign their goals, they develop new goals, and develop a process over, again, 5 or 6 years to support those goals. This conversation began as part of conversations related to our more recent strategic planning process, where out of that were discussions about structures and zones, equity, and enrollment. The future dates talk about staff overview presentations, the working group committee presentations, opportunities we took to update the community as we moved through it. And most recently, the last working group committee meeting was on March 10th. Again, a thorough process. Going back to that strategic planning point, this is the goal that came out of that strategic planning process. Again, this is before this conversation took place. Out of that, the goal was to provide each student with a rich array of academic enrichment and diverse social experiences, but also the focus was to determine the elementary school structures and zones that will maximize equitable access to student learning opportunities. It should be shared that as a part of this process, this is input from both the community members and the staff that talked about ideas that funneled down to this goal. The working group committee had a number of things, many things to sort through. One protocol question that Mr. Kimmick and I tried to bring about to the forefront at each meeting was asking that group, is there a model or are there models that could better address access to opportunities and that would put forth best possible learning experience for all students? Again, I use the word anchor. That was one of our anchoring questions. In order to support the notion of being thorough, the working group committee did have a lot of concepts and content to sort through. First of all, we tried to pull on all the available research that we could find. A, there isn't much, and B, I would call it inconclusive. However, out of the research, we did learn that when you add transition to a child's process, student achievement can come down. When you think about a realignment as an example, transportation could become a factor. Parent involvement, if the school has a shorter grade span, could be reduced. Things of that nature came out of the research analysis. As mentioned too, the community had multiple opportunities to share their input and questions by way of surveys, also with community update input sessions that Mr. Kimmick and I took part in. We also couldn't help but notice our own district's history. We've been engaged in conversations in the past that the outcome was rezoning, or the outcome was we love our neighborhood schools. Or higher enrollment going back a few years. So we did look at the district's history. The working group committee itself developed its own information. Big kudos to our principals and fellow administrators for taking part in the process, presenting on various models, creating content as we went along. The staff had opportunities as well for input by way of surveys. Also, they sat in on the working group committee, as I mentioned before. And lastly, and most recently, Dr. Ross Haber was the demographer who was secured to do the demographic study, which of course gives us projected enrollments for the next 5 years. Lastly, all of this has been shared with the community throughout the process on our website. The models that we've reviewed have included two basic concepts: rezoning, which is a redrawing of the attendance zone lines to affect the balancing of enrollment within 4 schools, or realignment, which is noted here in models 2, 3, and 4, which would be a reconfiguration of each building. Example, Mount Horeb could house pre-K through 2, and ALT could house 3, 4, and 5. In that concept, the students that would, once they left Mount Horeb, would go to ALT. Similar balance could be for Central and Woodland. I'm making it up to give you an example. But that's the difference between realignment and rezoning. All of these models have been thoroughly thought through. I mentioned before that we have a previous high watermark, so to speak. In 07 and 08, before my time here, our enrollment was higher than it's projected to be in the next 5 years, which Mr. Kimmick, I'll give him credit, he thought, well, let's look at the realities of that time when our enrollment was so high. So we pulled out some challenges and benefits of that time when enrollment was, higher than it's projected to be. Some of the challenges were arrival dismissal, support staff responsibilities varied across buildings, space. Some of the benefits were having dedicated teachers for various programs, multiple sections at all grade levels, more social opportunities for students by way of having more students in each building. Dr. Ross Haber was the demographer hired to provide the study. The scope of his work included a 5-year enrollment projection by school using current attendance zones, a facility analysis to determine the capability of each building, grade level organizational study based on projections, and lastly, and it's yet to be conducted, an attendance zone analysis to balance enrollment by school based on the projected new housing enrollment. This is an image of the past 5 years, in essence. So we have, going back to 16-17, our district enrollment was 1752. We've since then dropped by about 214 students, or 12%. If you look in the far left column in blue, you'll see the high mark, as we say, from the 07-08 year, just as a comparison. With the exception of Central, who's gained 1 student over the last 5 years, each of the other 4 buildings have declined in enrollment over the last 5 years. I think these are stats that we know. Dr. Haber also took the current attendance zone map and placed on it the new housing developments and where they will be. The obvious takeaway from this map is that the Woodland zone and the Central zone are where most of the building is taking place, and naturally, therefore, where most of the enrollment may be impacted if nothing changes. Looking ahead at the next 5 years, Dr. Haber projected district growth inclusive of new housing developments. His projection is that over the course of the next 5 years, the district may see an increase of 430 students related to new housing and related to regular organic growth. Similar chart, looking ahead at the next 5 years. We're projected, as I mentioned, to increase by 430. The difference in this scenario versus the scenario in 07 and 08 is if you look at the numbers and the locations of these numbers, you'll see that Central slated to grow by 98 students, Woodland and slated to grow by potentially up to 193 students. So the imbalance that the district, both community and staff, has been talking about, if we look ahead 5 years, is looking to be quite exacerbated by the new housing developments. Looking at a potential increase in enrollment by about 28%, rounding up. This is another existing look at the district and the current attendance zones and simply where houses exist right now. Moving into key findings, as I mentioned earlier, we learned through research that school transitions can have an impact on overall student academic achievement. COVID has been a reality, is still a reality, and the committee was very sensitive to what the world, the community, each school, teachers, and students have been through in the past 2 years. We closely examined grade level configurations. We noted that school structures, as I mentioned before, can influence parental involvement. Parents noted in their survey that if it's not broken, let's not fix it. Staff feedback noted nearly equal support for rezoning and realignment. We also took into consideration the financial implications of any kind of change, including but not limited to busing, routes, and student time on buses. More findings, and this is more from Dr. Ross's work. There are no space concerns in any of the 4 elementary buildings moving into the 2022-23 school year based on the numbers that he's shown us. Dr. Haber recommended implementation in the 23-24 school year, but not to go later than the 24-25 school year, as he believes, I'll say this in my next statement, that neither Woodland nor Central would have the capacity to accept the new enrollment if nothing changed within that time frame mentioned. I already shared that Woodland slated to receive up to 193 new students, Central at 98. ALT and Mount Horeb currently have the available classroom space to accommodate the growth of the next 5 years. Central and Woodland do not. I'm quoting Dr. Haber here, and then I'm going to move into my stick figure picture because it's more meaningful than it looks. Dr. Haber said, making changes to our current attendance zone will be, quote, a substantial rezoning project. And I want to let you know that I don't want to say it was the biggest anchor, but it certainly was one of our biggest anchors. We're families, kids, and real people. That we're having conversations with numbers and charts and spreadsheets. But every single member on this committee is well aware of the fact that we're talking about students that may one day present at their school with their parents behind them, and families that have become intimately knowledgeable of a building and its culture. So we are well aware that anything that we recommend, we have thought through the human side to what may come about from these changes. To that point, it may be possible to move students in a manner which won't isolate them from many of their peers. As an example, we would hope not to move one family from a neighborhood to a different school, but more the entire neighborhood, or at least a portion of that neighborhood. And of course, as we move into this, new zones have to balance both the community values and the known challenges that we've talked about. At the conclusion of each of our working group meetings, we had a pulse check. We wanted to see where we were. We wanted to see what progress had been made, what questions were lingering. The March 10th working group meeting, which was the last, where we heard from Dr. Haber, we asked the question, kind of point blank, which option do you feel best provides each current and future student with the goals stated from the strategic plan? And what is the best timeline for that? The answer came out that 82%, or 22 of 27, believed that rezoning was the best option to give our Warren students the best opportunities moving forward. Pre-K through 2 and 3 through 5 was the most popular realignment model. 22%, or 6 of 27 members of the committee felt that that was perhaps the better option. I should note that at least one person did vote twice on this. Secondly, we talked about timeline. 96% of this group believes that we should not do this with an implementation date of September 2022, 6 months from today. 4% thought we should. The recommendation that is going to the Board of Ed is to maintain the current elementary building structure, develop plans to rezone the 4 elementary schools, and to implement this plan for September 2023. Just to review a list of suggested next steps. The admin team has seen this. This has not been put in, we haven't added much great detail to that, but essentially, once the recommendation is received, or once the board makes a decision, we would move into identifying priorities as an admin group, as a district. Over the summer, we'd finalize our action plans. We'd engage with our transportation vendor to determine what this means for Dealaman, talk about proposed route changes. We had finalized the attendance zones in the fall. Over the winter of 2023, we'd conduct community and staff information sessions. And finally, in spring and summer, we'd finalize the staffing adjustments and be sure to have a very strong communication campaign to all parents and students and staff members involved. On behalf of the working group committee, Mr. Kimmick and myself, thank you for your time this evening. And I'm here for any questions the board may have.
Thank you, Mr. Cook. Appreciate that presentation. Are there any questions any member of the board has? Mr. Croson.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Really appreciate it. Hello. Oh, sorry. Thank you very much for the presentation. Really appreciate it. Would we gain access at any point to the full demographic study? I'm just interested in some of the assumptions, methodology that was used to arrive at that 430 student number.
Certainly.
Yeah, so we will, not only will we provide it to the board, but it'll be on the district website as well. We're just waiting on the final edited version. Yes.
And do you know, was the township planner involved in the demographic study process?
I believe Dr. Haber reached out to the town as absolutely as part of his process, yes.
And then, Dr. Mengel, this might be a question for you. Should the board accept that recommendation and move to rezoning, would the existing committee be involved in the rezoning process, or do you imagine that more as an administrative function?
That's a good question. I don't think we've fully vetted out those steps. We were not imagining that all 30 whatever people would be there, literally drawing lines on maps and all of that, that would be more of an administrative task. But before that was adopted, it would come back for public input. The board actually would have to adopt that in the fall because it affects transportation and all of that.
And lastly, I just want to thank you and all the members of the working group for developing what appears to be a proportionate response to student growth. not going too far while still trying to plan for some things that can be very unknowable, right? So I appreciate your work and where you guys landed.
Thank you.
Any other, Mr. Valentino?
Mr. Cook, thank you. That was an awesome presentation, and I know you and the working group worked really hard to get that together. Was there talk at all, as this would potentially get implemented, of grandfathering existing families in their schools, and then as those students age out, then new families in that neighborhood would then find the new zone?
We certainly mentioned that in the spring, one of the possible priorities might be looking into what that would look like and be like logistically for our up and coming fifth graders. So yes, it's part of the conversation. Haven't landed on direction.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Mr. Bishi, please.
I was going to say, having been to a lot of the meetings on the committee, you guys did such a thorough job. I was very, very impressed. You thought of everything. Beyond what I think you even had to do. So then, though, I'm looking at the next steps and I'm realizing, wow, you put a heck of a lot of effort into what you already did. And I'm looking at that, and to go along with Mr. Valentino and Mr. Croson, there's a lot of heavy lifting yet to be done, right?
Yes.
Like, and how do we do that? You know, and is that, I could see there's a lot more work to be done, things like grandfather, where do you draw the lines and everything? So we got a lot of work ahead of us, but very good job bringing it to this point, at least, you know?
Well, thank you. Yes, and I agree. A lot of work.
Yeah.
Ms.
She stole my thunder. No, I was just gonna say, because I was on the
Yes,
committee,
exactly, right.
heavily involved, and I mean, just a tremendous amount of effort and forethought and strategy and empathy went into this process. It was so amazing, the community involvement and just having representation from all of the impacted people. You know, people showing up for 2-3 hours of their time, doing homework in advance, reviewing survey data to make sure that this is as well informed as possible, knowing that these are people who are impacted at the end of the day. So just tremendous credit to you, Mr. Cook, and to Mr. Kimmick, and to thank you to everybody who was on those committees. It was really an impressive process that was that they went through. So.
Thanks so much.
Any other comments? In closing, I would echo the thank yous, Mr. Cook, Mr. Kimmick, the board, those on the committee, the community, and the feedback's critical in something like this. We need to hear from the community. These are their schools, these are their neighborhoods. They have to have a say. So thank you very much for allowing that, and very much for putting this together. Very well done.
Thank you.
Okay, we will now move to the tentative budget presentation. Mr. Hagel and Dr. Mingle.
Okay, while we're getting this set up, I just want to echo the comments from the board. Mr. Cook, Mr. Kimmick, the entire leadership team, parent, did quite a phenomenal job. We've been talking about it at these meetings in earnest since probably last summer. To Mr. Bishi's point, we'll continue talking about it. There are still a lot of important decisions to be made. But just for the board's reference and the members of the public here and online, the intention is that there would be a resolution on the next board meeting agenda to approve that direction. And then we have a lot of work to do after that as well. With that, if you thought it was hard to follow the students with your presentation, we get to talk about the budget. So very briefly from me, I do want to mention that this is Mr. Hagel's first budget with us. So congratulations on getting us to this point. We reviewed the mission statement with Mr. Cook's presentation, but essentially the budget is a representation of the values of a school district. And in our case, the whole child approach to education. I do want to mention the work of the Finance Committee, which puts in a huge amount of time and energy into getting to the point where a budget is ready for public consumption. Mrs. Zahn, who is the chairperson of the Finance Committee, Mr. Bishi, Mr. Brzee, Mr. Valentino, and as I mentioned, Mr. Hagel on his first budget in the Warren Township schools. The process, as you know, takes pretty much an entire year. Almost as soon as one budget is adopted, we start working on the next budget. That process includes the budget managers, the principals, and the directors, people who have budget lines, putting in their requests in the fall, we're doing that over the course of the winter. And every year, waiting for the state information to come out. And this year, that came out even later than usual and had some interesting new challenges built in, which Mr. Hagel will talk about when he gets into his section. There are a few priorities I want to highlight, especially areas where there might be growth on the expense side in the budget this year, for next year, I should say. We presented several months ago about expanding our preschool program. That both costs us more for staff, but also is bringing in more revenue. So you'll see that on both sides of things. We are proposing to expand in-district special ed programming next year, both in that preschool program and beyond, with a new LLD program, Learning and Languages Disabilities program. The budget for the first time fully funds 7th and 8th grade field trips. We brought back field trips in the past to K through 6. This includes the 7th and 8th grade field trips, which had previously been funded by parents with support from PTOs, supports academic enrichment activities above and beyond what we've done in the past. This is some of the funding that we used from other sources this year to help support programs that were previously provided by PTOs who were not able to provide those programs because of Food Day is not running this year. We were able to bring that money in from COVID relief funds and other places. This budget has that money available to continue all of those programs from the district next year. It maintains what is a very long-term community priority of small class sizes. We are the envy of the region as far as our class sizes go, with a board adopted class size preference of 15 to 18 students, absolute maximums of 20 to 24, depending on the grade level. And it allows us to anticipate some of the enrollment growth that Mr. Cook was talking about at Woodland School and Central. Although we don't anticipate running out of space in either school next year, we do anticipate students moving into both schools over the course of the school year as housing comes online. And so we need to make sure that we're ready to add sections over the course of the next few months in those schools as needed. On the efficiency side, most of this is information that we've repeated year after year for the last 5 or 6 years. While enrollment was going down, our staff contracted, and we share staff across schools at this time. We work really closely with the high school and with our vendor to make sure we're operating our transportation as efficiently as we can. We have increased our in-house special education programming over the last 6 or 7 years quite extensively, which allows us to be more efficient by not sending students to out-of-district private schools. And in addition, it allows the students to stay with their neighborhood peers, which is really important. We participate in an energy program, which helps us save money there. And as everybody here knows, not only through our referendum, but also in our own in-house construction project, we were able to keep our facilities in excellent shape. We did see a state aid increase, which I'll go into more detail on in a second. We've been able to capitalize on state support for referendum projects twice in the last several years, increased tuition in our preschool program in next year's budget, increased monies from our summer fund program. Our initial enrollment for summer fun is exceeding expectations, and we're seeing good revenues coming in there. We have received federal funding not only for COVID relief, which is not really reflected in the budget directly, but also in technology purchasing programs. And we have been providing transportation on a small scale for some other districts as well, which brings us revenue. So I think this is an important state aid story. So the headlines in the newspapers right now are about increased state aid, but it is important to recognize that we have still not in Warren Township gotten back to where our state aid was in 2007-8, which is at the height of that enrollment that you saw earlier. State aid was cut completely to 0 in 2008-9, and we've been gradually moving rapidly the last couple of years, but moving back towards where we were. If we continue on the trajectory we're on now, I think next year will be the first time we exceed what used to be the high state aid. So we're happy to see it go up. We're still not back to where we were in the past. With that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Hagel.
So my part of the presentation is to talk about the how we pay for these things that Dr. Mingle talked about. Revenue in our school district is really comprised of 3 major parts. First part being the tax levy. This is a 6-year review of the tax levy here at Warren Township Schools. And you will see that with the exception of 1 year in 1920, we have been below the tax levy cap of 2% here in New Jersey. This year, the tax levy is set at an increase of 1.43%, which is an additional $600,000 to $700,000 into the budget. You will also notice at the bottom there, it mentions that the average tax levy increase over that 5-year period is about a little more than 1%, which is a fantastic Yes. Is that better? Yeah, okay, thank you. Sorry about that. If you compare us to other districts, you will find that many, many other districts go to the tax levy cap at 2% or greater many, many years. In years where we don't go to the tax levy cap, the board is allowed to what's called bank cap and put tax levy money aside for a future year. Because we did not go to cap in 2021 or in 21-22, the current year, that meant the board had at its disposal in the finance committee as we put together the budget, $1.3 million in banked cap from those prior years. You can't see it because it's hidden by that bar at the bottom, but this budget does not utilize any of that bank cap. We had no bank cap from the year 1920. That was at 0, so we weren't losing any. But what that means is that cap that we had access to will roll over into one more year. So next year we'll have a decision to make as to whether we want to access some of that banked cap in a future year. In addition to the last 2 years of bank cap, we're going to create some new bank cap because again, we did not go to our 2% tax levy cap. What I'd also like to mention at this point is in 2020, July of 2020, the state altered healthcare in the state. And in doing so, any savings that came from that healthcare law was supposed to come off of the tax levy as savings to the taxpayer. The first budget year in which that calculation occurred was this year. And I'm pleased to report that Warren Township Schools actually did have some healthcare savings during that reporting period from 1920 to 20 and 21. And what that meant is our tax levy cap was required to be below the 2% level. However, the state, in our opinion, had some issues with the calculation. They showed more savings than they should have. They showed a $230,000 savings when in our opinion, the savings was approximately $47,000. After providing a restatement of the assumptions and an appeal for special circumstances, they did revise that adjustment down. And what that meant is it didn't actually change our tax levy because we set the tax levy to be in line with Chapter 44, assuming no appeal was successful. What it did do is it increased the amount of bank cap that we're going to roll into a future year if we feel it's necessary to take that. And that's at $190,000, $191,000. Now, looking at the budget from a total perspective, you will notice that the budget from last year, the current year we're in right now, and the budget that we're proposing for next year rose by about $863,000. Again, that increase comes from three parts, the largest of which is the tax levy. The second piece, which Dr. Mingle discussed, the state aid that went up about a little over $100,000. And then the third piece was increase in tuition, both the preschool expansion as well as summer fund. Your budget cannot expand greater than your revenues expand. Flipping to the other side of the ledger, the expenses, you can see that this pie chart really demonstrates how much of our budget is really set in salaries and benefits. What that means is we don't have a lot of discretionary spending. The monies that we spend each year, we have to spend. They're either part of our labor contracts, they're part of our out-of-district tuition. Almost all the expenditures that we have, there's not a lot of discretion in them, and they grow at a rate of 2 or 3 or 4%, which is higher than our tax levy cap. So it becomes a very, very difficult set of challenges when you start managing the budget. Actually, to point that point out, you will notice that if you take just the contractual salaries that are in the budget for this current year, and you compare that to this upcoming year, the one we're talking about this evening, you will see that they increased by 2.5%. That's in comparison to the tax levy, which went up by only 1.43%. So what that means is we either have to find revenue from other places, such as state aid increases or increase in tuition, or we have to cut in other non-contractual salary parts of the budget. And then I'd like to just conclude by talking about what this means for the average taxpayer. So as we talked about, the tax levy is going up by 1.43%, but that tax levy is paid by taxpayers dependent on two other pieces of information. The first is their assessed value of their house and the overall assessed value for the township. And when you divide the assessed value of your house by the total amount for the township, that creates your portion of it. And as the percentage of, as the assessed value township-wide increases, you will take note that the amount of taxes that are paid by an average taxpayer actually decrease year to year. So even though the tax levy is increasing by 1.4%, you will notice that the taxes on the average assessed home in the community are only going up by 0.4%, which is, doing the math in my head here, about $30. That concludes our presentation. Are there any questions? One other thing I should mention, tonight is, the budget gets presented twice. Tonight is what's called the preliminary budget presentation. And tonight on your agenda, you're approving the budget, the submission of the budget to the county office for their review. The county office will work with myself and Dr. Mingle, ask us questions, make sure we followed all of the laws as they apply to the budget. They'll let us know that in probably a couple of weeks that our budget's been approved. And then at that point, we'll be authorized to bring it before the board for an adoption here, a budget hearing in late April. At that point, then the budget is adopted by the board and the tax levy gets set.
Thank you, Mr. Hagel. Are there any questions from any board members regarding the presentation? Mr. Bishi.
Do you want to
please.
do it now, or do you want to do it when we actually talk about the the vote, B3?
No, it's fine.
Okay, good.
Fine.
So I had thinking of three things. Being a member of the finance committee, by the way, chairwoman, and you guys did a great job, kind of at least trying to bring me up to speed on this. So I appreciate the detail that we went through. Number two, I'm just trying to get having only gone to a couple of those meetings, I'm trying to get my hands around, or my head around the PTO fund, what we're, the activities that the PTO formerly funded that is now in the budget, and like the class trips or all those activities. And you provided a lot of detail today, but I haven't gone through the listing of all those activities that are covered. And so I'm just trying to get my head around, what the school district does, what our budget's designed to do, and what's kind of extracurricular, or what the PTO is trying to do. And so I just want to understand that a little bit better, which leads to my third and final point, just to expand on what you said, Mr. Hagel. I guess this is just preliminary, so it can change before we actually adopt the budget at the end of next month, right? So I have time between now and then to actually ask those questions and get my head around better the PTO items that we're funding, right? Something like that. If I do have an issue, I don't want my approval tonight or voting yes to indicate that I understand it fully and I'm all on board. I could have a couple of questions that I would like to understand and maybe would not be in agreement with the budget at the end of April.
So yeah, just to reiterate, I don't have the resolution in front of me, but if you read the resolution very carefully, what it states is that the board is essentially granting permission to Dr. Mingle and myself to forward the budget to the county Office of Education for their review and approval.
Right, and it's called as a tentative.
Yeah, and it's tentative. I've called it preliminary budget. That's typically what it's referred to as. And then, really there's three steps. Step one is tonight. Step two is the review by the county office. And then step three is the budget hearing, which occurs in late April. We are required to provide public notice of the budget. It gets printed in a newspaper. There's a very, very lengthy advertisement that gets published. And I'm not saying that this hearing isn't important tonight, but the April hearing is the true budget hearing.
So I said I only had three things, and I got two more thoughts. It could change for other reasons, right? Might there be other items that change between now and April?
Well, one possibility is the county office might find something that they want some clarification on. That's one
Right.
possibility.
Right.
The board members are still digesting the information that's been
Right, good
provided to
point.
them. So, yeah, I mean, Um, Ideally, the budget stays static at some point, but, there's certainly room for comment and discussion, I think, along
That's the
the
idea,
way.
behind- like even the public could come in and talk. Yeah, That's
Absolutely.
the whole idea, right?
Yeah, that is the
Okay.
whole idea.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Any other questions or comments from any board members? Mr. Grossen, please.
Well, thank you very much for the presentation. I appreciate the work that the Finance Committee has done during this process. And while I understand that the discretionary spending is a small portion of the total budget, I do have concerns around raising or increasing the budget to any extent that is driven even by a very small portion in us taking things on from the PTO because they can't afford to, because they don't do food days, which we have not allowed them to do. So I do have some concerns there. Obviously, it's not $867,000 worth of it, but I do have some concern in that regard. I don't know if we're able to see a breakdown of how much in strict dollar amounts that portion of the discretionary spending makes up, things that the PTO used to provide for. I think that might be helpful as well, because it bringing on additional items into the district budget that we may not necessarily have to do if we go back to food days, which is still an open question, gives me some pause.
Thank you. So I just want to clarify a piece of that, which is that the proposed budget includes more than what PTOs used to fund for certain programs. So there's been a long-term conversation that has gone on at least as long as I've been here about the 7th and 8th grade trips, and a desire to see those built into the district budget like K through 6 trips were. And so this budget does that for the first time. So the PTOs did not previously fund those trips to the full extent. So there is, while there is money related to the PTO piece, there's additional thought there as well. And I shared with the full board today kind of the several months of conversations around these things. In the fall, the Finance Committee's direction was, if at all possible, to build in those trips into the budget, which is why they're there. The total dollar amount, Mr. Croson, is 120,000 of the budget is related to those enrichment and field trip experiences. And to your point, if decisions were made differently about the lunch program and those monies then shifted back to somebody else funding them, that would, as we do every year, free money up for other priorities in the budget, or move it to EOI end of year for future capital projects or whatever else the board decided at that time. So they need to be here now because that's a possibility. If that possibility isn't determined, which I don't think it would be determined before the final budget needs to be adopted, that would free the board up to make other decisions too. But we can also, if it helps, we can think about if there's a way to, I think at the next Finance Committee meeting or next month, there was already some discussion about showing what we spent this year on those sorts of things. So that'll be coming to the board as well.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I do think that I still have the same concerns because that has not been settled yet. And once you levy the tax, government in general doesn't then give it back to the people, right? And so I think part of my concern is the fact that this isn't our money, it's taxpayers' money. And so we're saying that we're going to ask them for an additional $120,000 because we might be taking these things on. And if we don't, we're going to keep it anyway and then just decide what we're going to do with it. Again, I respect the process and the sheer amount of work that goes into this. I don't envy you, but I do have concerns.
So just a question on that, Mr. Croson. If we were to remove the funding and then need it, how do you see getting that funding back? And I'm just playing devil's advocate. Nothing. I appreciate your point, and I totally get it. I'm just trying to play the other side of it, where if we were to remove that 120,000 and then in the budget, and then at some point beyond after the budget's passed, determine that it was needed for whatever reasons, where would you anticipate gaining that back from, since we had already passed? It's not an excuse to do it. I'm just trying to understand the other side of it. That's all.
Yeah, I would imagine that it would take the role of private fundraisers, or perhaps that would then inform some of our decisions about the lunch program, or whether or not we have a non-compete agreement with a particular vendor and allow the PTOs to do snacks or things like that. But in my experience, once government takes money from people, they don't generally ever give it back. So I just want to be very cautious about the amount of money that we're asking of people.
Totally get it. And when you mentioned PTOs, so you would say we would be asking the PTOs for that to make up that difference?
The portion that they historically had, I believe, which was 120,000.
Got it. People what? Apologize. Do you want us to replay?
I don't know if I can repeat it the same
Let's
way.
go to.
I don't remember it myself. Thank you, though. I appreciate that. Any other board members have questions or comments regarding the tentative budget?
So I don't really usually speak about the budget stuff, so bear with me. So we are, based on this year and the decisions that were made about the lunch program last year, we had helped offset the funds that the PTOs didn't receive from food days for the current school year that we're in right now. And anticipating potentially that same need for next year, we are allocating $120,000 for that. And what we were just talking about now is, because to Mr. Croson's point, yes, when the government takes money, they don't tend to give it back. So the thinking here, or what was just discussed, is that potentially we don't do that. We don't have the $120,000 allocated for PTO activities, et cetera, and that, what was the idea for how they would make that up? The PTOs would then get private fundraising.
I don't know if the words in your mouth, that's what you would.
Yeah, I would imagine that, I mean, not having yet served on a PTO, but I would imagine that it would be a combination of private fundraising. If we do go back to food days, obviously that would be that plus some, from what I understand from what they used to take in. Or even if it's a quasi food day program where, they're selling snacks after school, something like that, to be able to compensate for the money that was not levied.
Do we know if that $120,000 figure was the food day average for the PTOs in the past years, or was that from like cumulative fundraising and events and food days all thrown together?
So the monies we allocated this year were based on, you can get all this in the previous finance committee minutes and I can share it back with everybody, but we did analysis of what PTOs were funding at each school that was related to the student experience directly. And we determined that was about $20,000 per elementary school. That's not the full spending of the PTOs. PTOs spend money on teacher appreciation and all kinds of other things that we're not allowed to spend taxpayer money on. So we looked at just the student experience items that we're allowed to spend money on. The principals worked with district administrators and we came up, that was about $20,000 per elementary. We estimated that time, that would be about $80,000 at the middle school. We actually only allocated $40,000. And the reason for that change, our proposed trips this year are not overnight, so they're cheaper than they would have been otherwise. The PTOs didn't fully fund those trips anyway, so that was a piece. And much of the middle school PTO money that went directly to student experiences were for grants to teachers that we can take care of those supplies separately. So that's where the 120 came from. That's definitely not the full budget of a PTO, but those vary considerably from school to school and how much higher than that they go.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Mr. Bishi?
You may not have had time to look, we canceled our curriculum committee meeting tonight, so I had a chance to go through what the superintendent sent out this afternoon. And it was very helpful, Mr. Valentino. Like, it shows you chronologically the buildup of how it occurred, 21. But chronologically, to Ms. Keller's point, the way I was looking at it was pre-COVID, 2020, what would that be? 2019, 2020. We had a good thing going. It wasn't broke. We had the food days. And then I'm trying to go to post-COVID, sometime it could be this budget year, June of 2022, I guess is when, no, July of 2022. too, is what we're talking about here. Maybe we're in a post-COVID world then, and we can have food days again. So if it was working 3 years ago, it should work now, and we wouldn't need the 120. That's, and there's a lot of mess in the middle of all, trying to fund and all COVID and everything. I just don't know if we'll hit it by July 1st of 2022. And I don't know when we'll be able to make the decision on food days. And I think Mr. Mingo, you said it's probably not by the final budget next month. But if we could say, yeah, we're going to do food days, then I'm like, all right, well, then we're back to what we were doing 3 years ago, and we're back to square one.
I don't want to speak out of turn on the decision, the working group on student lunch, but that group is meeting next week. And we shared with the finance committee a timeline of that information. We've scheduled a finance committee meeting right after that so that we can share that update with the finance committee. But it's a much bigger conversation than food days. It's about the entire student lunch program and making and then all of that. So I don't want to go into those details. That will be a board presentation itself as well.
I think it also just marrying two topics together gets into a little bit of the elementary growth and the reasons for growth and the economic scales of the growth. So it's not an excuse or reason. It's just it's not as binary as it, at least it was originally in my head. There's a lot of different aspects and lenses and optics and quite a bit. I will say I'm happy to see the field trip funding in this. Ms. Keller, yes.
I mean, I think this is I don't know how many people are on, 20 something people, but totally agree. Don't think of any tax increases insignificant, right? But just an N of one here, having done food days, and I think Mr. Valentine, I've shared this with you. I got really loud. That increase, was that $30 a year?
31.
That's maybe 1 week of food days for 2 kids. Sorry, I just, to keep it in perspective. For those of us who have done food days recently. So that's all I'm gonna say. I have no other grand point, but just to keep the numbers in perspective, that's all.
Mrs. Zahn.
I think it's valuable to take a good look at the historical information regarding PTO funding of what are student experiences and whether or not it's even appropriate to have PTOs fund student experiences to begin with. It's also, I think, a presumption, maybe the false presumption to suggest that it was working fine and it can then therefore again work fine. I don't want to speak on behalf of any individual PTO, but I do know that that is a presumption that you should probably probe deeper. Okay. I don't know that I really want to say much more about this. I hear that you have a lot of questions. This is something that's been before the Finance Committee for 8 months at least. So we can certainly continue that conversation, but for the purpose of dealing with the preliminary budget tonight, I think maybe we should look at this at the next Finance Committee meeting and take anybody's questions then rather than.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you, Mrs. Zahn. Any other questions, comments from any board members? Please. Yes.
Mrs. Zahn usually says this, I'm going to say it. Remember that you have a budget buddy on the finance committee. That was, I believe, a suggestion Mrs. Zahn made several years ago that, so please, if you're not on the finance committee, you have questions, your budget buddy is your go-to person, but we're also happy to answer questions. So if there's something you want to understand, more deeply or the history of it or something like that, just reach out to me and we can make that happen. Just to make sure everybody has all the information they need.
Mrs. Zahn, please.
Just one more thing. Just to clarify for anyone listening what it is exactly we're talking about. We're talking about the 5th grade event. We're talking about assemblies, Authors Day, Field Day, International Day, Read Across America Day. We're talking about special event days such as Earth Day tree plantings, family reading nights, Olympic Day, Science Day and science fairs, talent shows at the middle school assemblies, campus beatification projects, 8th grade graduation, the 7th and 8th grade trips and related expenses. That's what we will not be doing if we don't put $120,000 in this budget and the PTO doesn't pick it up. So let's just keep in mind what gets stripped.
If either the PTO or the board doesn't pay for it,
Then those go away.
right? And that was what was useful in what you had sent from the prior year finance committee this afternoon, Matt. Like,
this-
and that's why I'd like to, I didn't see that until tonight, so that'd be
Yeah.
useful to look at. at our
These are
next-
all student experiences that all students participate in. These are at no cost to the individual students at all grade levels. And these are experiences I think that I certainly could argue are integral to the school experience. Children who get to put their hands in dirt and grow things, who get to go on field trips, listen to authors read from their own books, experiment with coming up with your own science concept, testing it, putting together for the first time, 3rd and 4th graders doing trifold boards, and parents coming in and looking at these amazing questions that they've raised and tested using the scientific method. It's Central School doing their invention convention. Kids coming up with the most amazing and wild ideas, creating prototypes, and having members of the public and the administration and the families and their grandparents show up and see this. This is getting away from your textbook and from the extraordinarily good education we offer our students, but that is classroom bound, and doing things that are not classroom bound. It would be a significant loss, in my view, to our students and to the school experience if we are not able to offer these options.
So my assumption was we as a district had funded that, back to the budget decision, for decades through the PTO. And now we want to toggle from PTO funding to the budget funding. That was my assumption. And so this has changed over the past 3 years, and that's what I want to understand.
I
You know,
think
like
that
you said in the
there's an
committee.
opportunity to understand that, and we should understand
Yeah.
that. So let's have the conversation. But I want to make sure that anyone listening to this outside knows what we're talking about.
Any other comments before we close out this presentation? Seeing none, thank you again, Mr. Hagel and Dr. Mingle, for the presentation. Discussion items, there are none. Moving on to committee reports. Finance, Operations, and Security Committee, Mrs. Zahn, if you would lead us off.
The Finance Operations Security Committee met Thursday, March 24th, and had the most recent extensive conversation regarding the tentative budget, which resulted in the presentation we see here tonight. It included, and I really would encourage all of the board members to go and look at the minutes to this meeting, an extraordinary number of summaries and memos from Mr. Hagel, our BA, with regard to the Chapter 44 adjustments. He presented some of that here for public consumption, but it was really quite an effort that did result in a significant decrease in that hit to our future ability to do bank cap, and would have resulted in an even lower tax levy cap for this season. Which leads me into kind of my thank yous. This is a long process, as was stated earlier, and without the effort of Mr. Hagel and all of his staff, who are too numerous to name, including all of the budget centers and the buildings and grounds and transportation and our building principals, all of whom this is an annual ongoing process. And the members of the Finance Committee, which in this year includes Mr. Bishi, Mr. Brizzi, and Mr. Valentino, but I would not want to omit Mr. Bellish and Mr. Franco, who were Finance Committee members in the year of 21, who were also part of developing the budget that we are looking at here tonight. It is the recommendation of the Finance Committee that the board approve item B3, the adoption of the 2022-23 tentative budget. Also discussed at the Finance Operations Security Committee was an update on the options for student food service. Mr. Valentino is the Finance Committee's representative to that working group, and he provided an update. There is a summary of progress to date that is attached to the Finance Committee minutes, and I encourage you to look at that. As Dr. Mingle stated, the next meeting of the working group for the options for food service, student food service, will meet on April 4th. The Finance Committee's next meeting is on April 11th from 5 to 6 o'clock. That is the same day as the next Board of Education meeting. The Finance Committee will meet from 5 to 6 and will then make itself available to the public in an open session from 6 until 7 o'clock. So the public, this is part of the new effort to, on a quarterly basis, open up the various board standing committees to the public for interaction. So if any member of the public wishes to come and interact with the Finance Committee, the opportunity to do so is April 11th from 6 until 7 o'clock.
Thank you, Mrs. Zahn. Ad hoc return to school committee, Dr. Mingle, if you would not mind sharing an update.
Sure. So the committee had a scheduled meeting on March 23rd, but in accordance with our board norms, we did not hold the meeting because we didn't have two board members present. The agenda was summarized in memo form for the board. As far as the board agenda tonight goes, there's the recommendation to abolish a policy that's already not been in effect since last summer, just to clean up the books. And the plan is, unless something unfortunate happens in the next several weeks or months, that the committee would not schedule a next meeting, which is the same for our district committee as well. So that's good news. We hope that we can continue down that path.
And I guess along those lines, I look forward to disbanding this committee. I'm sure you do as well, Dr. Mingle and the entire board, not to minimize the members' contribution, but it's a milestone for myself. And I don't think there's a student, sibling, a parent, a neighbor, staff, teacher, a parent, an employer, a boss, anyone that, you know, we couldn't thank to get us to where we are. It takes a village. So I want to thank everyone. It's joyous to be here. I hope we never go back. None of us want to go back. And one less committee meeting on top of that is fantastic for all of us. So thank you for that. We'll move on to public commentary. This is the first of two public commentary for agenda items only. If you could kindly state your name and address, affiliation if appropriate, direct all comments to myself. You will have 3 minutes to share with the board your comments, and we look forward to hearing them. This is for agenda items only. First, we'll start in the room if there's anyone in the room. Seeing none. If there's anyone participating via Zoom, if you could use the raise your hand feature. Five more seconds. Okay, seeing none, is there a motion to close public commentary?
Motion to close public commentary.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed, abstention. Public commentary is now closed. There will be an additional opportunity towards the conclusion of this meeting for any topic at all. Items for board consideration and action. Dr. Mingle, are there any items you wish to provide context?
Just one. I just wanted to mention for C2 with the additional substitute teachers that a big thank you to Sandy Dodd, who works in the board office. Every new name you see on that list represents several hours of work of making sure that those individuals have all the paperwork they need. It's a coordinated effort of a lot of people, but Mrs. Dodd is the person who is in charge of that process. And we have added quite a few new substitutes since we initiated our programs back essentially at the turn of the new year. So thank you to her for that support.
Thank you, Dr. Mingle, and of course, thank you, Mrs. Dodd, for that. Are there any items for board consideration and action? Any board member wishes to pull for separate vote or discuss questions? Mr. Croson, please.
B3.
Separate vote or discussion? Other items any board member has? Seeing none, Ms. Keller, would you be so kind as to lead us?
Motion to move items for board consideration, A1, B1 through B2, C1 through C7, and D1.
Second.
Yes, please.
Mr. Bishi,
Yes.
Mr. Crozen,
Yes.
Mr. Desai,
Yes.
Ms. Keller,
Yes.
Mr. Valentino,
Yes.
Mrs. On,
Yes.
and Mr. Brzee.
Yes.
Motion's passed 7-0.
Motion to move item B3.
Second.
Mr. Bishi,
Yes.
Mr. Crozen,
Again, I just want to reiterate that I appreciate the work of the Finance Committee and Mr. Hagel on this. My concerns remain. This isn't a question of whether or not we should have graduation and field days and things like that. I think we're all in agreement that we should. They provide immense educational value to our students. And I don't think anybody up here is questioning that. The question at the heart of this is whether or not we need to incorporate that into our tax levy moving forward, because once we do this, we're very unlikely that we would ever not incorporate that part of our budget. So we're basically saying that this will always be part of the board budget, as opposed to waiting to see what happens and what transpires with our lunch program and other potential means of private revenue that has historically and could in the future fund those very important initiatives. So because of that concern, I vote no.
Mr. Desai,
Similar concerns that Mr. Croson just expressed. I'm going to say no for now.
Ms. Keller,
Yes.
Mr. Valentino,
I'm going to abstain until I discover some more about it and study some more. This is my first time on the Finance Committee. For this time, I'm going to abstain.
Mrs. On,
Yes.
Mr. Brzee.
Yes.
All right, the motion passes with a 4-2-1 vote.
So just regarding the budget, I would encourage all the board members to reach out and if there are questions prior to the next, prior to any meeting. I think everyone on the Finance Committee is fairly open. Administration is certainly open into answering questions. So I would just want to encourage that for those who have access, leverage your buddies if you have them. If you're not comfortable with your budget buddy, shoot Dr. Mingle an email, send Dr. Mingle an email, I should say.
Mr. President,
Yes, Mrs. On, please.
just as the chair of the Finance Committee, every opportunity and every effort is made on the part of the Finance Committee and certainly the administration to make sure that questions are dealt with promptly and opportunity for interaction happens. Everybody here has a budget buddy, so I really want to encourage and echo the board president's encouragement that everyone reach out to their budget buddy. The questions raised tonight, they're valid, but the opportunity to do so has been there for quite some time. And we are on the verge of hitting what are extended deadlines for the submission of our budgets to the county. And we can't miss those deadlines, period. So between now and the next time that this has to come up for its final vote, please, I am available at all times. If you can't reach your budget buddy as chair, reach out to me, please. And I will facilitate in any way possible access to any information that you need to address any questions that you still have lingering. And I'm sure the same is true for the administration.
Thank you, Mrs. Zahn. Moving on to unfinished business. I don't believe there is any new business. Seeing none. Public commentary. This is our second of two public commentary. If you could kindly state your name and address. I direct all comments to myself. You will have 3 minutes to provide the board with your comments, and we look forward to hearing those. We will start in the room. Are there any comments in the room? Seeing none. Are there any comments on Zoom? If you could kindly use the raise your hand feature. Mrs. Silver, I apologize. I actually couldn't see the hand with the color of your wall, but I see it now. Go ahead, please. You're Mrs. Silver, you may be on mute.
I'm sorry, Heather Silver, Quail Run. I don't ever come unprepared. I always check the agenda ahead and make sure I'm ready. But some of the things that came up tonight really kind of stuck with me in a way that I just can't sit here whether I'm prepared or not. I have to thank Mr. Bishi, Mr. Croson, and Mrs. Zahn for pointing out what has occurred in our district for more than a decade that I've been here. The fact that the work the PTOs have done never went unnoticed prior to COVID. The work they did for the districts in both Warren as well as the high school. The money that was raised through food days by parents that worked for no money on their own time in snowstorms when a vendor couldn't make it and we were up at 4 a.m. deciding whether or not to feed the kids and how we should do this and all the things that maybe our newer parents don't know about. I'd happily give a TED Talk on all of it. I'm grateful that someone has pointed out there's a history in our town, and our town is unique in that we don't run the way every other town does. And maybe that's why a lot of us chose this town. I didn't want a school lunch. I didn't want every single school to be exactly the same. I didn't want equity and all of the buzzwords that now occur in everyday life. I wanted that. I chose the house I chose because the school I chose, because of the district I chose, because of what the parents put into it. And that mattered to me. I came from Philadelphia. I came from a public school system for the upper part of my education and a private school education from the lower part of my education. So I have backgrounds in both. And I don't in any way attempt to act like I'm in any way an expert. But I think I have enough background in my 50 years that I'm proud to say of being on this circle and going around and watching the circular motion of our district in the past several years. And the fact that something like what occurred in the last meeting where the students came and discussed a dress code change and it was immediately addressed and they felt they were heard and listened to was so refreshing. And the fact that things were brought up tonight that maybe weren't prepared ahead of time and weren't discussed and decided whether or not everybody agreed is so refreshing that maybe everybody doesn't come into tonight with exactly the same opinion. And that maybe everyone can sit there and honestly give their thoughts on how it may affect them or their children or their neighborhood or their school or whatever it may be.
Mrs. Silver, you're at 3 minutes if you could wrap up.
And thank you. And I'll wrap it up there because I don't even know where I'm going. I'm just so angry listening tonight at some of the things that occurred. And I just hope that by me coming on unprepared, as you know, I always come prepared, maybe it'll make everyone think just a little bit before they make the next decision. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Silver. Any other comments for the board? This could be on any item, does not have to be on the agenda. Seeing none, is there a motion to close?
Motion. Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed, abstentions? Public commentary 2 is now over.
Mr. Brizzi, before you go to the next motion,
Please.
give me the copy of the paper. So we can take a recess if you'd like to talk about this first, but the requirements for Board of Education voting on a budget are that there must be a majority vote of the entire board, not of the quorum, which means that there need to be 5 yes votes for a budget. We have to have a budget by 11:59 PM tonight. As of right now, we do not have one that meets that requirement. So we'll either need to take a new vote or the board will have to negotiate a new tentative budget while we're here.
Could we take let's take a 5-minute recess. I just want to refamiliarize myself with this. It's 8:31 now. If we could reconvene in 5 minutes, let's say, if that's acceptable.
You can mute in, you could, yeah, you can.
So I appreciate everyone's patience. We are going to continue, we are going to extend the recess till, I'm going to say 8:50 PM Eastern. And I'll give another update at that point. So we're extending recess until that time. Thank you. All right, well, thank you, everyone, for your patience. It is 8:51. We are now back in session. The recess and extended recess has concluded. We are going to revisit an item on the agenda for this evening, item B3, B as in Bravo 3, adoption of the 2022-2023 tentative budget. Is there a motion to move the budget?
Motion to move item B3.
Second.
Mr. Hagel, when you have a moment, could you kindly call roll?
Mr. Bishi,
Yes.
Mr. Crozen,
No.
Mr. Desai,
Nope.
Ms. Keller,
Yes.
Mr. Valentino,
Yes.
Mrs. Zahn,
Yes.
Mr. Brzee.
Yes.
The vote is 5-2.
Thank you, Mr. Hagel. Executive session.
Yep.
Ms. Keller, would you kindly bring
Sorry,
us?
I lost my page. Whereas the Open Public Meetings Act, NJSA 10-4-11 permits the Board of Education to meet in closed session to discuss certain matters. Now therefore be it resolved, the Board of Education adjourns to closed session to discuss pending or anticipated litigation or contract or other negotiations and or matters of attorney-client privilege. Action will not be taken upon return to public session. The length of the meeting is anticipated to be approximately 20 minutes. And be it further resolved, the minutes of this closed session be made public when the need for confidentiality no longer exists.
Second.
Second.
Second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? The board is now in executive session.
We're going to be going all the way down that hallway to the front of the building. Just to confirm.
Motion to return to public session?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed, abstention, the board is back to normal session. Public session.
Motion to adjourn?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, abstention. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful night.
Thank you.